Okay, so we are now going to do a brief video on a couple more hormones. We'll start with the hormones released by the thyroid gland. So the thyroid is located at the base of the neck in front of the trachea, so literally right on your throat there. And it's stimulated by the thyroid stimulating hormone that's released from that anterior pituitary that we talked about last video. It produces two important hormones, thyroxine and calcitonin. So thyroxine targets all body cells. It increases the rate of metabolism. So the more thyroxine you have released, the more you convert sugars into energy. But the problem here is when you do too much, you might have hyperthyroidism. So this is where you are literally producing way too much thyroxine, and you will have difficulty sleeping, constantly alert but very tired. Um, it's tough to deal with. Typically, these individuals are very skinny. They can't sit still because they have um, a lot of that ATP being produced. If you have too little thyroxine produced, or hyposecretion, or in other words, hypothyroidism, this is when you have a low metabolic rate. You have less energy due to the fact that you're not having any sugars converted into ATP through that cellular respiration process. You're cold all the time because you're not very metabolically active. You have dry skin. You don't lose weight very easily. In fact, you gain weight quickly. You have goiter, a condition where you really build up a lump in your neck, and that's because you have so much thyroxine building up in your. You have so little thyroxine building up that you have so much thyroid stimulating hormone um, accumulating um, in an attempt for the body to convert the thyroid stimulating hormone into active thyroxine that can be used to increase metabolism. So the big lump there is caused because you have a lot of thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, produced, and it basically swells because it's in such high concentrations. And the only reason the body's making all this TSH is so that it's hoping, well, if I can get thyroid stimulating hormone uh, to kick the thyroid into gear to get it to produce thyroxine, then I wouldn't have this hypothyroidism issue. I wouldn't be so tired or so have such little metabolic activity. But unfortunately, it's not working. Thyroxine's not being produced, and the TSH just builds up, and then boom, goiter happens. This large lumped neck. So in this case, yeah, the negative feedback loop isn't working, right? You would have TSH in high quantities that should turn off the production of TSH, but it doesn't. The TSH keeps getting produced because it's trying to make more thyroxine. Thyroxine's not getting made. TSH isn't turning off. You just have it accumulating. Ooh, looking nasty there. All right, so the negative feedback loop here for thyroid stimulating hormone should look like this, where you have the hypothalamus releasing thyroid stimulating hormone releasing factor. It's going to target the anterior pituitary, which is going to target the thyroid stimulating hormone. Normally, if you're having goiter, the TSH is trying to target the thyroid gland and tell it to release thyroxine, but with goiter or hypothyroidism, thyroxine is not being made because the thyroid gland is somehow broken. So TSH keeps getting produced because it's trying to turn on the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland's not turning on, it's not making thyroxine, so there's nothing turning TSH off, keeps getting produced, boom, goiter, big lump on your neck. Normally, though, with a proper functioning thyroid, thyroxine's produced, manages metabolism, and then it turns off through a negative feedback signal the signals from the hypothalamus and from the anterior pituitary. Okay, the parathyroid gland and the thyroid gland are involved in various homeostatic mechanisms, and they work closely together. So the parathyroid gland and the thyroid gland are going to help regulate calcium levels. The adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys. Anything with the renal name is usually kidney related. The adrenal gland is made up of two glands, the medulla, which is the middle portion, and the cortex, which is the outside portion. And so the medulla is activated by the nervous system, and it makes two hormones during stress: epinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine, otherwise known as noradrenaline. But we'll call it epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so what happens in short-term stress is you need an increase in glucose, so you convert glycogen, the storage form of sugar, into glucose, the active form of sugar. And you increase heart rate, you increase your blood pressure, you increase your breathing rate, you increase your blood vessels, you increase your pupil dilation, because you want to be active. Think about it. You get up and you see a bear, boom, you're scared. You want to run faster, you need a high heart rate, high blood pressure, high breathing rate, high dilation, high pupils, large dilated pupils. You can run away and survive. You see somebody you have a huge crush on, boom, same thing, short-term stress. The adrenal medulla is what's involved in the production of those short-term fight or flight responses. It's part of the sympathetic hormone nervous system. The adrenal cortex makes aldosterone and cortisol, which are cortisol is involved in long-term stress. So unlike the short-term stress from the adrenal medulla, the epinephrine and norepinephrine, the adrenal cortex is going to have cortisol release, which is going to produce, target the liver and your muscles. And so it's going to increase the amount of amino acids available in the body. The liver is going to convert those amino acids into sugars or glucose, which gives you more energy. So cortisol is going to increase blood sugar levels. So this is why highly stressed people are at a higher risk for developing conditions like diabetes, because the more stressed you are, the more cortisol you're releasing. The more cortisol you're releasing, the more you're converting blood sugars into like glucose, active sugars, because you're constantly stressed, right? Think about what a stressed person needs. If I'm stressed all the time, I need to always be thinking, and I'm always worried, and I'm always just preoccupied, and it could be a physical stress, could be an emotional stress, from my job or a relationship or finances or whatever in life is stressing us out. And those high cortisol levels are increasing the improper conversion of sugars during what the body thinks is critical stress, but really it's just, you're stressed about school, or you're stressed that your girlfriend didn't like Snapchat you back on time. And so we are developing this like high strung state of stress where cortisol levels are averaging higher in our societies, in our bodies, where they don't need to be. So big moral of this story: to save your health, let cortisol be active when it needs to be, and just zen out when you can, because you don't want a lot of cortisol bumping around your body when it doesn't need to be there, messing with glucose levels. So too much, so a hypersecretion of cortisol is going to cause something called Cushing syndrome, and a hyposecretion, or too little secretion of cortisol, is going to cause something called Addison's disease. So Addison's disease, weight loss, low energy, low blood pressure, and so you get this kind of yellowing of your skin. Think about it. You don't have very much cortisol released when you have Addison. So if it's hyposecretion, you're not converting things into sugar very often. You don't have very much energy, therefore. Cushing syndrome is the opposite. You have a lot of cortisol being released, and so this is going to start breaking down your bone prematurely. You're going to have high susceptibility to bruises because your blood vessels are weakened. So too much cortisol is going to classically cause this sort of classic Cushing syndrome sort of baby face, and it is not healthy. Too much cortisol is a very bad thing. So you can pause this if you'd like on this and just take a quick look at the short-term versus long-term stress response. Long-term stress is based off of the cortisol response by the the adrenal cortex, versus the adrenal medulla is going to be responsible for the epinephrine and norepinephrine fight or flight responses. Okay. So quick flow chart here for short-term stress. Sympathetic nervous system triggers the adrenal medulla, which triggers epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will increase heart rate and breathing rate. There's actually no negative feedback loop for the short-term stress, which makes sense, right? When you think about it, why would you want an increased heart rate when you see a bear to be the exact signal that turns off the release of epinephrine? Because then that would be counterproductive, right? Like you see a bear, you're like, oh crap, I see a bear, epinephrine's released, increases your heart rate, increases your breathing rate, increases your pupil dilation, and you're getting ready to run, and then as you're running, because of all this stuff being high, the highness of all these things actually shuts itself off. That'd be silly and counterproductive. So it doesn't happen. There's no negative feedback loop for short-term stress. When the stress is gone, the function of epinephrine ceases. It stops. The feedback loop for cortisol or long-term stress is different. You've got an adrenocorticotropic hormone releasing factor targeting the anterior pituitary, which releases adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone targets the adrenal cortex, hence the adrenocorticotropic, right? Which releases cortisol. Cortisol converts amino acids into sugars or glucose, and high levels of glucose are going to trigger the body to turn off the production of cortisol. But the problem is, if you're constantly stressed, then you will always have high levels of cortisol, and you'll always be converting proteins into sugars improperly. This isn't good. So relax when you can, and get stressed when you have to. Easier to say than do, but try your best. Okay. And so we'll talk very briefly about insulin and glucagon in the next video. All right. Thanks.